Speaking Italian has been one of my life's greatest challenges. Having lived so close to my grandparents in my early years, all they spoke was Italian, but they spoke the Southern Italian or the Calabrian dialect. And that is what I grew up speaking as well. And at one time, I think I was pretty fluent in that dialect. I remember growing up and going to school at St. Anthony's on the south side of Des Moines. And when new children would immigrate to the States, like Tony Tamia and Josephine Carlino, the nuns would call me aside and they would say, "You need to be their interpreter now," or they would send me out in the hallway to explain their lessons, or I would be the one to teach them the Our Father or the Pledge of Allegiance or whatever. So I had it in my early years, that great connection, being able to speak both languages. I do have an Italian tutor that I work with weekly, and my Italian is pretty good. My cousins tell me when I go down to visit them that my Italian is just great and they understand me. I think they're being complimentary, but let me say this, my Italian is passable when I can get my point across. My Italian gets better. The more I'm in Italy, I'm rusty when I first get there, but by the time I leave, my Italian is pretty good. So you just need to practice, practice, practice. I had a very, very special trip to Italy 4 years ago with my father and my 3 sons and my husband. And it was one of the most special times, I would say, of my life. My dad's biggest goal on that trip, it was very, very important to him that we all connected to each other, that the next generation connected and got to know each other so that we would always have a reason to go back to visit the relatives, that they would have a reason to stay connected to us here in the U.S. We have a lot of fond memories around food. Well, I've always loved to cook. That's been sort of my passion. You know, one of the biggest differences between Italian cooking and American cooking is simply the portion size. I have been amazed to realize that Italians in Italy eat many, many courses. They'll start off with a little antipasti and then have pasta or risotto or a soup or some polenta, and then they'll have a secondo piatto, which includes their meats and vegetables, and then end with fruits and nuts, and on special occasions a dessert. Now that's a lot of courses, but all of the courses are very small and manageable. We here in America want to supersize everything, and that is the biggest difference. I think that Italians are horrified when they see how much Americans want to eat of food that's not particularly good. They are real locavores, and I'd like to see us become locavores a little bit more. Eating what's local, not something that's come cross country or even from a different continent. I think those are some of the biggest differences in the food. I think it's really important for the next generation to know about their roots. We basically have the whole family here. There's about 30 of us here for every Christmas Eve, which Mom and Dad put on. And they really keep up the tradition of trying to have the 7 fish. Now, Mom doesn't make all 7 fish anymore, but she always has the bacala and the calamari and maybe another fish. And then, because some of the younger kids don't really care for that, we have some other foods, of course, but there's always Italian cookies and pastries that Mom has made and I have made, and we eat lots of nuts during that period of time, during the holidays, nuts and fruits, because that's what they do in Italy. And we always like to have a little Vinsanto holy wine, and my brothers like to slice their fruit real thin, and we'll dip the fruit and biscotti into the Vinsanto and that sort of thing. My sons and my nieces and nephews love to play bocce. I don't know how much bocce ball they really played back in Italy, but they're playing bocce now, so that's another thing that they're trying to keep alive and that sort of thing as well. When my grandfather, Francesco Tursi, immigrated in 1906, he came with his brothers and about 10 other cousins, and they all lived together. Now imagine in Terra Vecchia, 10 to 12 guys picking up and leaving all at one time, and they didn't know if they were ever going to see their relatives again. And most of them worked on the railroad and established themselves. Some of them had wives that they went back and found in Italy. Some of them married Italian-American women here in the United States. My own grandfather went back after being here and making enough money, went back to Terra Vecchia to find an Italian bride in 1913 and had to serve, unfortunately for him, in the Italian army for a number of years during World War I. He had worked so hard the first time. I remember him telling me stories about how there was so little heat in the places where they lived that they would have to break the ice in the basin of water before they could wash their faces. They sacrificed so much to make a good living here in the United States. As in my grandfather's case, after the war, he did find his Italian bride and he married her. My grandmother, Carmela Tursi, from his little village in Terra Vecchia. And they got married, but he was broke. So he came back to the United States. He only had enough money to get himself back to the U.S. And he said that he would send for my grandmother when he had enough money. And when he left not realizing that my grandmother was expecting my father. And it took 8 years before my grandfather, Francesco, had enough money raised to bring my father and my grandmother to the U.S. There was no Skype. There was no Twitter. There was no internet. There were letters that people wrote back and forth, but those letters would take weeks and weeks. They would send packages to each other, but those packages would take months. The sacrifice that they made was really huge, and I think it's really important that my children, my nieces and nephews, know about the sacrifices that their great-grandparents made and that their grandfather and grandmother made so that they would have a really nice life here in the U.S.